to Free Exchange, and today we're happy to have George Will, Washington Post columnist and Pulitzer Prize winner, with us to talk a little bit about the political situation and some other things that have been going on with him. And thanks for joining us today, George.
Delighted.
So my first question, well, my first statement is to say welcome to St. Louis. We don't get to read you in our newspaper any longer, so it's good to have you here in person.
I'm glad to be here and I sneak under the radar of the St. Louis.
Yeah, we had to smuggle you
right.
in. And this is related to my first question, which is, well, I saw on a video of your recent talk at Yale in the disinvitation series.
Dinner,
Yes, and you're talking about free speech on campus.
Yes.
And could you just give us a couple of comments about that? Because Lindenwood is a very different campus. We don't have those problems, so we'd like to know what's going on.
Well, you're fortunate. All these problems, as you call them, are optional. There really is no problem with free speech. The First Amendment runs from coast to coast, including campuses, although some campuses seem to have forgotten that fact. What I said to the William F. Buckley program, which is the Yale program that sponsored this dinner, sort of honoring us in a tongue-in-cheek way, those of us who've been disinvited from giving talks on campuses, is that free speech, it seems to me, has never been more thoroughly, comprehensively, and ideologically under attack in this country. The Alien and Sedition Acts arose from a particular fever of the moment. They were sunsetted and they disappeared. The post-World War I and post-World War II attacks on freedom of speech, again, were related to particular fevers. What makes this different is there is on campuses particularly the idea that free speech itself is a bad idea.
Right.
And it's a bad idea because, and this is a postulate I reject, today's students are so fragile and so easily frightened and disturbed, dismayed, and distressed by encountering ideas that they might not have heard before and might not find congenial, that they must be protected from speech. It's not freedom of speech anymore, it's freedom from speech. And the theory is that speech needs to be confined to free speech zones on campuses. Texas Tech University, for example, has 28,000 undergraduates. Their free speech gazebo is 20 feet wide. Go figure. I mean, they again have missed the fact that James Madison's First Amendment established the United States as a free speech zone. The idea that you have to have trigger warnings now, lest someone not be warned that they're about to encounter what I think you come to college or university to encounter, which is startling, upsetting.
Well, and the standards for the trigger warnings even keep falling. It's just to hear an opinion slightly different from yours on a terribly conventional topic.
Exactly. And anyone who says, I need a trigger warning, should be told politely but firmly that you need to leave campus because you're in the wrong place.
Well, I saw recently, I think it was a Christina Hoff Sommers talk, she had a few different episodes where the clapping was supposed to be triggering all sorts of negative feelings in students, so they were doing the jazz hands to replace that.
What is jazz hands? I don't even know.
So apparently it's on Broadway, they do their hands like that, so that's jazz hands. So that in place of applause.
Brandeis University, which can be counted on to be the most absurd at any particular moment, Brandeis University invited someone to give a talk raising questions about the hysteria, about the so-called rape culture on campus and the spurious statistics and dubious social science behind these assertions. Well, when it was learned at Brandeis that this person was going to come to talk, they immediately established a safe space for people who would be traumatized by just not going to it. They didn't need to go to the talk, but would be traumatized by knowing that someone was going to give a talk. So,
I believe there were teddy bears and all sorts of things.
Teddy bears, Play-Doh,
Yes.
Videotapes of puppies playing. I mean, you can't have a clear statement, and this is the serious point, of the infantilization of young people. I'm flabbergasted. When I was a young person going off to college, I wanted to be treated as much as an adult as possible.
Right.
There's a certain kind of young people, and I don't want to tar an entire generation with the eccentricities of a few, but there is a significant cohort on campus that says, please treat us as fragile children.
Well, and it's even more, it's pervasive outside of the universities now too. We see that in the last week with the events in Garland, Texas, where a number of columnists or commentators would say, I'm all in favor of free speech, but, and it's, well, what's that but doing there?
Well, there's a Supreme Court case back in about 1941. I get them confused. Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire and then Terminello v. Chicago. One of them, the early ones, the Supreme Court said, well, speech is not protected if it might provoke disturbance. Well, the Supreme Court soon realized they had just created what came to be called the hecklers veto, that if speech can be silenced because it disturbs people, people will show up to be disturbed.
Right.
So, but 9 years later, the Supreme Court rethought this and said it is the purpose of free speech to disturb the status quo, to discomfort the comfortable, and therefore we're going to trim back this doctrine that said free speech can be suppressed if it disturbs.
Well, and I believe there were some amendments to the Constitution proposed by the Democrats in the last year or two to amend the free speech, or the First Amendment.
Every Democrat in the Senate, everyone, supported amending the First Amendment to empower, they said it was campaign finance reform. Here's what it would have done. It would have empowered Congress to regulate the quantity, content, and timing of political speech about Congress. And to do this in the name of good government or, I don't know, it's all the usual campaign finance stuff. But it never before has anyone run for president, as Hillary Clinton is now doing, promising to make the Bill of Rights less protective of our individual zone of sovereignty. No one's ever done that before, and there's almost no comment on it.
It's surprising that she thinks it's a winning formula to say the problem we have in this country is that pesky Bill of Rights.
Well, it's a winning formula with the progressive left at the moment, and that's her only worry at the moment,
right,
is to try and keep Elizabeth Warren on the sidelines. And so on a number of issues, I expect she'll come out against free trade, although that was her husband's greatest achievement, was NAFTA. She's trying to calm down that part of the party from which a challenge to her might emanate.
Right. Well, it's been just absolutely shocking in a very short period of time, and the link between what happens on campus and what happens in Congress is I sometimes feel like the current administration, or many in power now, think they're still in the sophomores in the dorm debating things.
Yes.
And then trying to enact them at the dorm level and not really taking very seriously that this is an important thing that we should be cherishing.
Well, there are two happy aspects of this. One is the founders, in their wisdom, said our Constitution's not perfect, so we're going to include an amendment provision, so if we need to correct it. But it's going to be very difficult to amend the Constitution. You have to have a supermajority in Congress to send it to the states, where you have to have a supermajority of the state legislatures to ratify an amendment. So the First Amendment is not going to be changed.
Right.
We can start with that. Second, I think there's a wholesome pushback now. People are saying, wait, how did we come to this point that we're frightened of other Americans talking freely?
Oh, and it's with the trigger warnings. It's talking freely about just political issues. It's just if I'm uncomfortable or upset or offended, somehow someone's faux offense dominates someone's right to express what used to be considered just a normal political speech.
Well, a trigger warning attaches, for example, to the teaching of what some of us consider the great American novel, Huckleberry Finn, from in nearby Hannibal, Missouri. To make a point about equality and race relations, Mark Twain used what we call the N-word, something 200 and some times. So a teacher ought to say to his students, get over it. This was the 19th century. He's trying to make the following points, and we're going to teach this as it is, not balderize it and pretend it isn't there, or have a fainting couch so you can collapse in dismay when you read Huckleberry Finn, the book from which Ernest Hemingway said, all subsequent American literature flows.
Right. Yeah, and the odd thing is it's the point. It was making an actual point, and it was part of the point, which was they should be gushing over.
Yes,
or
exactly.
supporting. Well, you know, and it's kind of dismaying, but let's see if you have any positive things on this front. You said that there is a pushback, and is it just the absurdity?
Well, also the Supreme Court has been sound on this.
Right.
Supreme Court took one look at McCain-Feingold at first, which empowers Congress to regulate the quantity, content, and timing of political speech, and originally they upheld almost all of it in a 5-4 decision. Since then, there have been other challenges, and they said, well, wait a minute. The McCain-Feingold law says as you approach an election, there's a kind of blackout period when you're not allowed to mention certain things. Well, when you approach an election is when you want most robust. That's when people are paying attention, and that's when speech ought to be the most robust and unfettered. So the Supreme Court is on the case here, and it's 5-4 sometimes, which is more of a knife edge than you'd like to see basic freedoms teeter on, but so far so good.
Now, the issue of free speech is just one of the issues of constitutionality lately. And I believe the Obama administration has lost the most 9-0 decisions in history. And that's with having, I don't know, several, maybe three Obama appointees, or is it two?
Two.
And they also can't stomach some of the things going on. So this also fits into, I don't know, is it the Constitution that's in peril? Even if it's not the First Amendment, there seems to be...
The reason the temperature of American politics is so high right now is that the stakes are high. And the stakes are high is because we're arguing about very fundamental things. The relationship of the citizen to the central government. Do we value freedom more than equality of condition? Sort of things. But also because the founders were very clear. Ours is a government of limited, delegated, and enumerated powers. It exists to protect natural rights, rights that are natural in that they pre-exist the government. They don't come from the government. Mm-hmm. They are essential to human flourishing, and government exists to secure those rights. That's the word the Declaration of Independence used, secure. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and governments are instituted among men to secure those rights, not to give us our rights. And when it stops doing that, we change the government.
I guess secure and seize have become synonymous.
Exactly.
It's, well, how can you secure? We'll just keep it over here. We'll keep your rights over here under lock and key to keep them really secure. Now, we only have a few seconds left. Is there any other things you want to say about this issue? I mean, you say that the courts are fairly sound on this, so...
The courts are sound, the Constitution is with us, and people are beginning to hear all the special pleading. People say, oh, I'm all for free speech for me, but not for thee. And I'm for free speech unless, and I'm for free speech except, and I'm for free speech until.
Maybe we should just get rid of the comma after the word after free speech.
That's not what Mr. Madison had in mind. That's not what the great First Amendment decisions and the corpus of constitutional law say. They say we're for free speech, period, full stop.
Right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and we're looking forward to your talk in a little while.
Good.
Thanks. Come back again after the break, and we're going to have a discussion about Mr. Will's talk.
Last year, Missouri received 25,000 reports of elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. It is estimated that for every case reported, 5 more cases go unreported. Adult abuse claims victims across all socioeconomic groups, cultures, and races. It occurs every day, and we need your help to recognize and report it. Visit health.mo.gov for a list of warning signs to look for. Make a difference and make the call, 800-392-0210.
In Ferguson, we're serving up happiness.
In Ferguson, we're serving up hospitality.
In Ferguson, we're serving up peace.
In Ferguson, we're serving up optimism.
In Ferguson, we're serving up change. Ferguson is our home, and you're always welcome here.
I'd like to finish school, but with kids and a job, I can't find the time to go to class. I have a few hours here and there. I would have to drive, park, and try to make it on time. Whoa, like that's a lot to ask. If I could find a program that worked around my schedule, I would do it.
Lindenwood Online. Responsive faculty, smooth registration, quality education. We have your answers.
Hi, welcome back to Free Exchange. We're going to follow up the interview with George Will with a discussion between me and our colleague Rachel Duchant and hear her reaction and just talk a little bit about what free speech means on campus and in society in general. So welcome, Rachel.
Thanks.
So we just sat and watched the interview
Yep.
that we had of George Will. And what's your first reaction to that?
I feel terrified.
Terrified,
Yes,
okay.
I mean, that really is my reaction. I think that Will focused largely on the political and legal nature of our rights. Of course, I mean, he holds that the rights themselves are natural, but they're secured politically and legally. And he was fairly confident about our current situation, which is fine. But I was thinking more about the cultural side of the question. In other words, what's our social and cultural mood when it comes to free speech? And
It's quite shocking that we're even talking about it, and this is even a normal conversation to have, and you feel the need to defend free speech.
Right, and
especially on campuses.
It's the rise of ideology. You know, this is what's correct, and your traditional viewpoints everything's sort of turned upside down. And it's like a remaking of the intellectual world. It's very disturbing to me.
Yeah, no, 30 years ago, it would have been the left that would have been the most ardent supporters of free speech because perhaps they would have been the voice that was more suppressed at the time.
Right, and when you know, he was talking about the infantilization of college students, of women. This is the exact point that Camille Paglia makes and talks about being a 60s radical and how it was all about taking ownership of yourself and your body and your sexuality and the idea of you having the responsibility and that it's so bizarre to her that things have taken this turn. And it's the quote unquote radicals that are now on the other side of the conversation. It's really a baffling thing.
Yeah, and actually we should say that this isn't a huge issue at Lindenwood, perhaps yet. We'll see.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do you view as kind of what's leading up to this, at least on campus, or do you think the campus is a problem of its own? Do you think this is a broader cultural thing that's infected campus?
I will say one thing before we talk about campuses in general. We did have an incident at Lindenwood.
Yes.
Where the pro-life students had chalked on the sidewalk what I consider to be fairly innocuous things. I mean, I know some of the pictures that pro-life groups and things can show can be very shocking, but it really wasn't anything like that. It was pretty innocuous. But
it was just words even, right? It wasn't.
Yeah, I think it was like call, the Crisis Pregnancy Center or something like that. But a pro-choice student who does counseling with women who've gone through abortions erased it without anyone's permission. And so there was a big debate, and there was a debate in the newspaper about it. And she said, the women, it was a really good example of this actually, because she said the women that I counsel, when they walk by this chalking, it'll be disturbing to them. That's what she said. It will upset them. And she was empathizing with their disturbance. And so she thought, I've got to get rid of it.
Well, so there's an internet meme, which is it's a picture of someone the words on it are, your rights end where my feelings begin.
Oh,
right? And
I haven't seen that one.
And this is exactly that. If you're disturbed or harmed by it, then this trumps, or mentally harmed by this, then this trumps all of the natural rights that other people have.
Yeah, but I want to say, while of course there are forms of speech, that could be harmful. Obviously, you can cruelly bully someone or something like that. John Stuart Mill's argument, one of his arguments for free speech in his famous article on liberty, was actually that speech, even speech that is clearly false, is not necessarily harmful. I mean, that's actually his view, right? So he's saying there's a number of reasons why we should be highly tolerant of speech, even when we know the person is wrong. And part of the reason, one of the defenses he gives is that if we aren't constantly in this conversation where we're debating these issues together, then we will lose the sharpness of our own view, right? In other words, we will forget what our reasons
How can you
are.
tell what's wrong if you never see anything wrong?
Right. And so if you have someone, arguing for a flat earth, you can say, no, that's ridiculous. Here are all the reasons we believe that the earth is a sphere, or whatever it is. And if you are never allowing the other side to speak, no matter how stupid or dumb or ignorant their view may be, then you're not sharpening your own position.
Well,
and that can be lost over time, over generations.
It's become that people's political views are viewed as right or correct rather than their views or their opinions. And the suppression of, you say to...
Well, my political views are right and correct. No, I'm kidding.
Right, well, mostly I would agree. But,
right. We disagree on a few things.
But it's the suppression, you say the suppression of things that are false, right? You say, well, we can't hear that because it's false. Well, now it's become, people can judge other people's opinions to be false, so therefore they're suppressed. So
right.
It's even beyond
right, where
what
it's
Mill
really
was
still
arguing.
debatable.
Yeah.
And that's another point Mill makes, which is really simpler even than the point he's making about false speech, which is that we don't necessarily know what's right. And we need to hone and be self-critical and so forth. And so we need to continue having that conversation for that reason. I mean, maybe you'll convince me, right? Or maybe I'll convince you over time.
Well, I guess my point is that we're 200 years behind Mill. We keep getting further and further away, so it's not really progress that we're not listening to Mill. We're even making it worse.
Yeah, and some of it is so well intentioned, and that's what I think is difficult about it. I mean, for instance, if you take Germany, and maybe in France as well, they limit Nazi speech,
right?
And you can sort of see what they mean, and yet the rise of neo-Nazis is very bad in Germany. I mean, it's a bad problem. So I don't know that it's effective. I mean, I think Mill is really right. Let these people speak and then have the conversation and let them be corrected.
Well, I think that...
And don't make them a persecuted group.
I think that much of the suppression of free speech now is not well-intentioned. I think it's actually very malintentioned. I think that it's just a brute force that people are trying to apply to shut up people who disagree with them. I don't think most of it is actually well-intentioned. I think it's just power that progressives want, and one way to get power is to shut up your opposition.
Well, let me play devil's advocate on that one. I mean, I think that we can think about, say, a feminist argument that has to do, like you and George were talking about, George Will, we're on a first name basis. Rape culture on campus, the date rape numbers, things like that. And there being a large cohort of females on college campuses who are victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault. There certainly is some cohort of that. And that these sorts of ideas are not neutral for them, that it's very difficult for them to hear. Now, I'm not saying that's not wrong-headed, but I'm saying that seems to be the concern.
No, I disagree. I think this is actually an example of my point.
Okay.
It's because of the numbers. I mean, they refuse to listen to actual facts of numbers, right? They'll make up or conflate ridiculously large numbers of the women who have been assaulted, and then shut you up if you question the numbers. And I think it's mostly to have some sort of a feminist control over what goes on campus. I don't think that that's a good intention. I think that's a bad intention. It's not actually about helping victims of sexual violence. If it was, then you would find the much smaller number than you're claiming and help them.
And help them to directly help them.
You wouldn't shut up anybody who's even trying to quantify that.
Well, and there is really an underlying point of feminist ideology here. And I don't mean to pick on the feminists. You could do this in some of the other areas as well. But, the notion of even repeating, the notion that we get our ideas very subconsciously through our language, like women being spelled WOMEN or something instead of YN. So we need to, because it's so subconscious and so hard to realize it's not really at the level of the intellect, it's at a lower level psychologically, then we need to sort of control how we speak and what we read and what we hear and so forth, right? Which is sort of the attack on the classical canon in universities, is we've got to get a lot of this out of the canon. These kids should not be reading Huckleberry Finn, right? They shouldn't be reading this stuff because they shouldn't even be hearing that. So that we can sort of remake.
I guess I just think all of that is idiotic. So I find it difficult for me to justify using that to suppress other people's freedoms.
I think that there's, as with most things, there's an element of truth, but it's ultimately wrong. And I think the element of truth is certainly that so much happens at the subconscious level. Absolutely it does. Of course it does.
Well, the idiotic part is that you should do anything about it.
Right. Well, I think what we should really do, and this was sort of the vision.
I have a lot of things going on at the subconscious level, and nobody's doing anything about it.
The vision, I think, of the intellectual life is that we bring what is going on at a lower level of consciousness up into our conscious level, right? And then we talk about it, and we can be rational and we can reflect on it. But there may be really at base a disagreement about human nature between conservatives and progressives on this. I mean, it could be that progressives really feel that we are not capable of being fully rational in that way. That's not something that people really are driven ultimately by emotions.
Well, I think they think that they can be, but other people cannot. That's why I think it's a position. Their positions are about them gaining power. It's not really about.
It's a power play.
Because if they're appointing themselves as having a better human nature than everybody else, so they're the ones who have to dictate what's acceptable or not. And that's exactly the opposite of the point of free speech, which is you don't have some group dictating what's acceptable to talk about.
And I actually want to go back to the original idea, that I brought up a few minutes ago of, these sort of abuse victims and their, and their sensitivity to hearing things. I actually think, and you asked me this at the beginning of the interview and I never got back to it, this whole question of, is this just going on campus or is it a whole cultural thing? And I don't necessarily have a set view on that, but I feel like there's a general mistake being made, a psychological mistake being made, which is that the way to help people is to protect them from being triggered. Being triggered simply means that your issues are coming to the surface. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That might be exactly what you need. It's like if you have a character defect, is it nice for me to say...
Quite a reach.
Yeah, I know, it's hard to imagine. But is the kind thing for me to do to sort of rationalize and justify away, it's okay, Howard, we all have our flaws. Or should I say, we do have our flaws, but one of yours is this and it's really a problem. I think you need to address it. That might be the really kind and loving thing to do. And the person I always think of...
Please don't if it comes up.
I do it plenty. But the person I always think of here is the nicest guy ever, Jesus Christ, right? Everybody talks about him being so nice, but he was really hard on people. I mean, he was not nice to the Pharisees, telling people to jump off a bridge, basically, into the ocean if they were going to oppress weak people, or calling them a brood of blood-sucking snakes. But really, I do believe that was kind. I really do. I mean, here you have someone who is going in a bad direction. And this is coming out in the rape arguments on campuses with this issue of alcohol abuse, right? Where some feminist Camille Paglia types are saying we have to talk about alcohol and the relationship of alcohol abuse to all of these date rape cases, or what we refer to as date rape, which is going on with the men, it's going on with the women. And everyone else is saying, if you even say that, you're suggesting that it might have some, bearing on who is to be blamed. Well, in the meantime, while we don't talk about it, these girls are continuing to get drunk, and these guys at these frat parties or wherever they're at, and they're getting raped, right? Well, so how loving and kind am I being?
This is why I don't think that it's actually about helping people, because they're doing things that harm them.
Yeah.
So cynical you might call it, but...
I think one of the hardest things to do is what I just described. The hardest thing to do is to stop and realize, if I help this person, or if I do something that seems helpful directly, but I realize that it's not, that I'm actually undermining, I have to admit that to myself, and that's a hard thing to do.
Right. Well, great. This has been a lot of fun, and thanks for joining us on Free Exchange, and check us out on the web by Googling the Hammond Institute.